welcome to another episode of Words from the Not So Wise. Now, first of all, I just want to say thank you. The response to my first Words from the Not So Wise video was really great, and I'm just glad that I touched on a topic that got people talking, and that, it was really nice to see that people appreciated that I had sat down and talked about that issue. Because by no means do I think it's a huge issue in the hobby, but I think, it does affect a small percentage of people. And yeah, I'm really glad that it affected people. So thank you very much for your comments and your feedback on that one. Today, I've been thinking for a while now about how I could do some beginners painting tips for people, because I'm not an expert painter by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not bad. I've got quite a bit of knowledge about colour theory, and I can slap some paint on a model and make it look up to a standard that I want it to be, but I'm never going to be a pro painter. And part of me was thinking, well, would people listen to me for painting advice when I'm not a great painter myself? But I started looking at it from a different perspective. So instead of doing a top 10 painting tips, I wanted to do like my top 10 pieces of advice for absolute beginners in the hobby. Now, some of these are practical tips about actual materials and how to take care of your brushes and your equipment and things like that. But then there are quite a few in this that are more about your mental state and how you feel and think about the hobby, or rather how I think and feel about the hobby, and hoping that if I pass that on, it might help some of the really new painters, maybe people who are a little bit anxious or nervous about joining Facebook groups and things like that, people who have literally just started. Because I've only learned these things over the past 6 months, even though I painted my first mini 2 years ago. And through learning these top tips, I think I've become a much happier person in the hobby. So without further ado, here are my top 10 hobby tips for absolute beginners. So number 1 is research. We're so lucky in this day and age that we have access to the internet. We've got every possible bit of information and every tip and trick for every single hobby in the world at our fingertips. So one of the things I did to kind of help my knowledge base on painting and basing and all the different areas of the hobby was that I subscribed to lots of YouTube channels. Now, not all of them are particularly relevant to me because I don't play a lot of Games Workshop games and things like that. But what I've learned is that by watching those videos, I don't really necessarily feel like I need that information from that video to paint that model, but the information you can learn from watching someone paint any model is really, really useful. You can pick up little hints and tips, and I watched a video of a model that I don't have, I will never own, but he used wet blending and I'd never wet blended before, so I watched the video, and through doing that I learn how to wet blend. So open yourself up to different people on YouTube and different articles and podcasts and things like that, and just try and learn as much as you can about the different ways that people approach painting and approach the hobby, and then you can take the little bits that you want from all of them. Number 2, don't be afraid to ask questions. There's so much to learn in this hobby, and there's no such thing as a stupid question. So if you don't know where you can find a particular product, or you want to achieve a certain effect but you don't know how, or if you're trying to do something and you can't quite get it right, get yourself on some of the amazing Facebook groups there are, or some of the forums you can find online, and just ask. You know, people are more than happy in this hobby to share their tips and tricks with people and to help new hobbyists out. I mean, I know in my previous Words from the Not So Wise video, I did talk about a negative experience I had, but those are few and far between. I don't think I've ever asked directly for advice and received any kind of negative feedback or negative comments or anything like that. On the whole, everyone has been so friendly and so helpful. So just ask, because everybody is learning. And I would recommend the Blackjack Legacy group as one of my favourite places online to go and ask for advice and chat to fellow hobbyists. It's a really, really great group. Number 3, and this was a really important one for me to learn, and it's pace yourself. Now, as with any hobby, when you first start, it's exciting and it's new and you just want to buy everything and do everything, and you know, you'll have 200 models and you'll say, right, I'm a painter now, I need to finish these by the end of the week. If you do that, you'll probably burn out pretty quickly. What I recommend when you're relatively new to the hobby is, if you are lucky enough to have a dedicated space or a room that's not going to be disturbed, is to set your things out, get the minis lined up that you want to paint, and just dip in and out of the room. You know, I mean, we've got it in our study upstairs. The cats aren't allowed in because they would trash everything. So we just leave out whatever it is we're working on or that we want to work on. And if I pop upstairs to bring some washing up, I'll just nip into the study and add a layer of wash to something, and then I'll go back downstairs. And then when I come up again to have a shower, once I've finished, I'll come in and, you know, add that colour or that highlight or something. I found it was very easy when I first started to kind of sit and just stare at everything and try and force myself to get everything painted really quickly. And that wasn't good for my mental state. I was putting too much pressure on myself to get stuff done. But also it wasn't good for my physical state, because I was spending so many hours at once hunched over a desk, and I've already got neck and back problems anyway, but it was really making that worse. So little and often, but also pace yourself with the speed at which you try and learn new skills. Don't run before you can walk. You know, pick up some minis and slap a base coat on. Leave it. That mini's done. You've painted it. Brilliant. And then next time you paint some minis, you might start adding a wash. But don't try and learn too much too quickly, because I did. And I found that I just kept disappointing myself, because I was trying to do these really, really obscenely skillful details on something before I'd even properly learned how to apply a base coat. And it fizzled. And it was another one of the reasons why I think I fell out of love with the hobby for a bit. So just make sure you take it slow. Number 4, try different brushes. Now, like with a lot of people who are new to the hobby, my first brushes were Citadel brushes and a couple of Army Painter brushes. And I believed that, you know, I would stick to those brushes because they're relatively inexpensive and they did the job. But what I found gradually was that as my painting skill changed and adapted and grew, I needed different brushes to suit my needs. Now, I know a lot of people are very kind of brand loyal when it comes to brushes, but over the last couple of months, I have tried various different types of brushes. And I will be doing a brush comparison video shortly, so keep your eyes out for that. But what I found is that different makes of brushes serve different purposes. So I will still use my cheap battered pound shop brushes for doing some of my basing stuff. I'll still use the Citadel brushes for slapping on a base coat, or again for doing stuff on bases. Then I've got a couple of different brands of Kolinsky Sable brushes, and one of those brands I think is fantastic for using contrast paints, but the other one I've got is brilliant for normal paints. And then I've got yet another make of paint that I use for a paintbrush that I use for applying washes. And because I've changed my thought process on brushes and I've kind of spread out and tried different ones, that's actually helped my painting improve, because I feel like I am taking my own painting method and style into account, but I'm also learning that different brushes can serve different purposes, and that enhances my painting in those areas. So that made a lot more sense in my head than it did when it came out, but hopefully you understand what I'm getting at. But yeah, don't be afraid just to buy one brush from this make, one brush from that one, because you might be really surprised with what you find. Number 5, clean your brushes. Now, I know this sounds really obvious, you know, a 5-year-old in an art class knows to wash your brush when you've finished. But what I mean by this is take extra care of your brushes. They are your main tool in this hobby, and they're not cheap. But if you clean them and you care for them and you condition them after every use, they will last you a lot longer. What you'll find with a brush is that they start to deteriorate relatively slowly, so you don't even really notice that it's happening. But a slight deterioration in a brush can make a big difference when you're actually painting. You might one day discover that you're not being as neat as you were, and it's not necessarily because of you, it's that something's just gone a little bit out of line with the brush. And this is especially important for Kolinsky Sable brushes. They need a lot of care, because once they go, and you can't really salvage them. So I would always recommend that you wash your brushes after every use, and I would also recommend using kind of conditioners and soaps and things like that to look after them. I'm not going to recommend any particular one just yet, because I'm still figuring that out for myself. But there's loads of different products out there that you can find. But as one of your first things you should buy when you're starting out in the hobby is some brush soap. Number 6, clean water. Now, I've been guilty of this myself. I will come into the hobby room on a Saturday with a nice pot of fresh water, and that pot of water will still be the same pot of water the following Saturday. Now, that's really bad, because it's really bad for your brushes. And also, if you think about it, every time you're dipping and washing a brush in there, you're changing the colour of the water. So when you then pick up a brush and dip it in the water to thin a paint, you're adding the little bits of pigment from the previous colours into your new colour. So it makes a big difference. Now, I'm not saying that after every single layer you put down, you should go and clean your water pot out. But what my tip is, at the end of every painting day, so any day where you've done some painting, get rid of your water so that you can start fresh the next day. But what I would also recommend is having more than one pot of water. So I have a pot of water that usually stays pretty clean, and that's the one where I dip my clean dry brush in to take some water to thin my paints down. I then have a normal paint dirty pot of water where when I've finished with the colour, I will wash my brush off in that pot. And then depending on what I'm doing, I might also have a third pot of water. Now that pot of water will be for washing brushes that have used metallic paints, that have used things like water effects, or things like gritty textures or typhus corrosion and things like that. And the reason for that is that I'm going to be using old battered brushes to apply those things anyway. The last thing I then want to do is wash that brush off in that water, put all those particles and nastiness into it, and then take a good Kolinsky Sable brush and dip it in that water because those particles will get into that brush and destroy it. So clean water and different water depending on what products you are using. Number 7, which I've already kind of touched on, is thin your paints. Now, this is also known as the thing that every single hobbyist tells you when you start out in the hobby, but you tend to ignore because it doesn't make sense at the time. People always said to me, thin your paints, make sure you thin your paints. And I tried it and I was like, but this is ridiculous. I may as well just be painting this model with water. And I just couldn't wrap my head around it. I found that the best thing for me to learn how to thin my paints was getting some Lahmian Medium from Citadel, because by adding that to my paint, it thinned it in a different way to water, but it actually taught me what the paint should be like. Now, I don't use Lahmian Medium for everything anymore. I used to, but I've learned what kind of consistency I want from the paint now, so that I know how much water to add to get the same effect. So that helped me a lot. And there are also options of using wet palettes, which I'm just learning to do and just starting to get the hang of. And then you can use things like Flow Improver. There's loads of different options out there. So again, try them all. You know, just mess around, get an old model that you're not too bothered about and just try the different techniques. Now, for those of you that you don't know why you have to thin your paints, it's because a model that's been cast will have loads and loads of details on it, recesses and raised parts. If you take paint thick straight out of the pot and put it on, the paint will flow or stick in those recesses, and then you lose all the detail on the model, or you run the risk of doing that, especially if you use very thick paint. One thing to be aware of is that even paints from the same manufacturer can have very different consistencies to start with. So you can't kind of go from a point of view of, oh, well, if I have one blob of paint on there, I'll use 2 drops of water, because that won't work. Because of the different pigments that are used in paints, different colours are different consistencies. So it's just a case of working with it and trying it and getting used to the paints and the colours that you have. And I promise you, after a little bit of practice, you will get a feel for it. And that's just what it is. It's a feel for what consistency the paint should be for the job you're trying to do. Number 8, don't be afraid to experiment. Now, I know makers like Citadel have paints and they give them a specific name and kind of tell you what those paints are used for. So a base paint is used for applying a base layer, and then the layer paints are to be used on top of a base layer. Contrast paints are to be used as a blanket base layer and wash all in one, and you shouldn't need to do anything else afterwards. But there are no rules in this hobby. You can use any product you want for any effect that you want. For example, a lot of the water effects that I've created on my bases have been solely down to me going, I wonder what happens if I mix that with that, and going, oh, that's pretty cool. You know, there are times where I mix 2 things together and just go, no, that doesn't work. But I've only lost, you know, a couple of pence worth of stuff. So don't be afraid to just try things out. If that says it's a layer paint, use it as a base coat if you want. Yeah, you might need to use more coats, but still, if it's the colour you want, go for it. You've literally got nothing to lose, and you might be pleasantly surprised by what you come up with. Number 9. Now, this one kind of links with the previous one, and this one is, don't be afraid to mess up. Now, this has probably been the hardest lesson for me to learn. I'm quite a perfectionist when I try and create art, and in the hobby when I first started out, I was putting so much pressure on myself to kind of do everything perfectly first time. And it blew my brain, because that's not going to happen. When you're new in any hobby, you're not going to get it right first time. So my advice to you is to just go for it. If it goes wrong, it doesn't matter, because these miniatures, these chunks of plastic that you slap some paint on, yeah, they're expensive, but if you put paint on and it goes wrong, you haven't lost that miniature. There are so many ways to fix any mistakes. So, you know, I might put a base coat on and start doing some layering and realise I've used the wrong colour. As long as I haven't got too much paint on there, I'll just take it back downstairs and spray it again and start from scratch. Or there are ways of stripping models. So if you paint something and you're not happy with it and you want to take the paint off, there are ways to do it. I don't know how to do it. But I know that there are ways out there that you can Google and research. But at the end of the day, what I'm trying to get home to you is that, first off, it's okay to make mistakes when you're new to a hobby. So just put that out of your head. It doesn't matter. But second of all, if you make a mistake when you're painting a mini or making a base, it can always be fixed. And last, but certainly not least, number 10, be kind. Now, obviously, I mean, you know, be kind to other hobbyists. If you're on a forum or a Facebook group or a live chat, be supportive of each other and offer tips and advice. You know, everybody is learning in this hobby. Everybody makes mistakes. Everyone has good days and bad days. Everybody struggles in different ways. So look after each other and big each other up. But what I also mean is be kind to yourself. You know, you're obviously watching this video because you're relatively new to the hobby. There is a lot to learn, and you're not going to learn it overnight. You're not going to become an expert painter within a couple of weeks. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to create and paint things that you're not massively happy with. But remember that it's human nature to be your own worst critic. You could paint something and everyone says, yeah, that's brilliant, but in your head you're going, oh, they're only being nice. But chances are they're not. When you put a lot of pressure on yourself to do well, you're going to view the results through almost a haze of kind of self-doubt. So just remember that every time you pick up a paintbrush and put some paint on a mini, that's more paint than it had on it 5 minutes ago. You've done something, you've taken a step, and you're learning to create these incredible things eventually. And like I said earlier about pacing and not putting too much pressure on yourself, unless you particularly choose to go down that route, it's not a competition. It's so easy with social media these days to constantly compare yourself to other people who have been in the hobby much longer, who've had a lot more skill and practice developed over years, or, you know, people who, you know, do it as a profession, people who paint every day, or retired people who spend, you know, 7 hours a day painting. It's not healthy to constantly compare yourself to what other people are doing, because at the end of the day, you're never going to be happy if you keep doing that. You're never going to be happy with the work that you're producing. So just remember to big yourself up and look at everything you paint and everything you do in the hobby as an achievement. So there we go. That is my top 10 tips for absolute beginners in the hobby. Now, a lot of this has come from personal experience and might not be relevant to other people. I also know that I waffled and went off on tangents in a few places, but that's just how my brain works. But I really hope that at least a few people out there can take something from this, and, you know, that it helps them become a more confident hobbyist. Even if, you know, just learning the idea about cleaning your brushes and changing your water and things like that, you know, that might help somebody down the line who hadn't thought of that. So yeah, I really hope that you get something from this. So if you liked this video, give it a thumbs up and maybe leave me a comment and let me know some feedback. If you didn't like this video, leave me some feedback and let me know. If you think I missed anything out, if there was anything else that you think is important, leave it in the comments for everybody to read, you know. It's not a definitive list. It's, you know, it's just the 10 that I thought were the most important. So I'll be back on Saturday with another All About That Bass video. And until then, happy hobbying.